Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 73 of That's a Good Question. What about Rittenhouse, Arbury, and the abortion case? Welcome back to this episode, and it's been a couple weeks, Pastor Ken, since we've recorded a podcast episode.
Yeah.
We took a break during the Thanksgiving holiday last week, and we encouraged folks to catch up on episodes they may have missed. But it's good to be back in the studio today, and we have a lot we could talk about. A lot has happened in the last 2 weeks. We had, just to list a few things, we had a controversial couple of court decisions. And just 2 days ago, the Supreme Court heard arguments in an abortion case that has the potential to overturn Roe versus Wade. So today we're going to answer the question, what about Rittenhouse, Arbury, and the abortion case?
Okay.
And now these issues, like all issues, if we're astute in our application of our biblical worldview, they have the relevance for us as Christians that they involve matters such as, think of things like self-defense, common grace, race, and the sanctity of life. So let's begin with the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict. He was found not guilty on all counts, even though he had shot and killed 2 people. So let's begin by talking about the background to that.
Well, that took place over a year ago now, in August of last year, when riots broke out in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and also in other places, but in particular in Kenosha, because there had been a recent police shooting of a black man in that city. Now, Rittenhouse was 17 at the time. He's 18 now. And he lives about 30 minutes from Kenosha. He actually lives in Illinois. And Kenosha is in Wisconsin, but it's near the border. But it's 30 minutes away, and he decided to drive himself along with a semi-automatic rifle to keep the peace, quote, keep the peace in Kenosha. He said he is said to have told people on the scene that he was a certified EMT, but in fact he was not. And apparently he did have a medical kit with him, but when he shot 3 people, 2 of whom died, 1 of whom survived, but he attempted to treat none of them with that medical kit. There's rioting going on, and he's now in the middle of it. At some point, there's a confrontation between Rittenhouse and some of the protesters / rioters. Let me just comment here. You know, let's really be careful to try to check our biases when we think about these things. And so even something like that, protesters or rioters, what are they? Well, if people are just marauding around and they're just doing damage and that kind of thing, then call them rioters. That's what they're doing. Protesting is something else. So some are protesting, but many are rioting for sure. One of the victims lived, as I said, and was able to testify. A reporter on the scene who was only just a few feet from Rittenhouse, and one of the men that Rittenhouse shot and ultimately died, said that the victim tried to grab Rittenhouse's rifle, and that's when Kyle Rittenhouse shot him. So that bolstered the defense's argument that he was defending himself because he was feeling he was in danger.
Yeah. So was he a part of like some official group or some sort of an ad hoc law enforcement group or something like that?
Not that I'm aware of. And I've tried to find out. It does not appear to have come up in the trial that he claimed to be any kind of an official in some way. It's hard to see how he could have been even, since he was a minor at the time. And he also felt the need to use a cover story for even being there. Because he falsely claimed to be an EMT. So if he was some kind of an official, he could have said that, right? It appears that what happened was he saw, like all of us did, on TV, the rioting taking place. And it was going on for a couple of nights in Kenosha, which followed the rioting in Minneapolis and in other places a few months earlier in protest of the George Floyd murder at the hands of police. So he, along with others from outside of Kenosha, decided to go there to defend Kenosha against the rioters.
So he was able to successfully argue then for self-defense, even though he went to the scene of the violence voluntarily and took like an AR-15 with him.
The prosecution argued that very thing in court, saying, really, you cannot claim self-defense if you created the confrontation to begin with. But that obviously did not win the day. There was evidence presented by the defense that he feared for his life, therefore he was justified in shooting. The jury believed it, and their verdict is what matters. And they had access to all of the evidence, and we do not. So I have no reason to criticize the jury. I respect their verdict.
Yeah, I really can appreciate that perspective, that stance when it comes to a trial like that. We watch on TV and see bits and pieces, but I've actually served on a jury for a murder trial, and I can tell you firsthand that it is difficult enough to adjudicate when you have all of the arguments firsthand and all the facts are presented to you right there in the room. So it certainly doesn't make sense to try and make a judgment when you don't hear all the facts or the arguments as they're presented in court.
But let me just interject here. One of the reasons that so many of us do that is because we're watching it, and we're watching it on our chosen source. So I come back to that. Those of you who listen to this regularly know that I keep coming back to that theme, our chosen sources of media, because they will choose carefully the wording. Is it protesters? Is it rioters? Is he a patriot for going out there, or is he just some kind of vigilante? And so they're going to shape the story for you. Just understand that. And so you're watching and you're being shaped by folks with an agenda very often.
So jurors are sitting in the courtroom hearing arguments and being presented with facts.
Right.
And you're sitting in a living room and your channel is presenting you with arguments.
Yes.
Not necessarily the ones that are
more
being
like
presented in
propaganda
court.
often.
And
Sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. So what issues or principles are implicated in this that we as Christians should be aware or concerned about?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few things. One, thank the Lord for our criminal justice system. That is what you said, is methodical and careful and designed to be dispassionate, as it allows the facts to be reviewed in the cool light of day rather than the white-hot tensions of the culture wars, which is what the Cryon, I think, Chiron or Cryon at the bottom, that's the crawl, at the bottom, is screaming at you from your chosen media source that's trying to get you, all jazzed up.
You say the I think it is called the Cryon.
Okay.
The little ticker across the bottom.
Yeah. Okay.
With all the latest news.
Yeah. And then whatever wording they want for whoever they're interviewing as well, because they'll put a title kind of at the bottom there. So it's not always a scroll. Sometimes it's just, what's there, but they're describing it in a particular way.
It's a headline, and it's indicative of what they're doing. They're not necessarily there to present facts. They're there to keep you watching.
There you go.
Yeah.
Exactly. Bear that in mind, all of us. Okay. So, but secondly, though I respect the jury system and the process, and therefore their verdict, I do see reason for concern that order can, as we saw there, so quickly break down. Because as we discussed several times, law and order are common grace, gifts of God in a fallen world. When they falter, then we are all vulnerable to evil. All of us are, and we ought to be very concerned when we see that happening. Now, some listening to us might hear me say that, and they say to themselves, yes, that's right, Pastor, law and order. That's what we need. People need to respect the law. And most of our listeners would point the finger at the rioters and the lawlessness there. And that's true, and that's fine as far as it goes, and I would agree with that. But people cannot be allowed to maraud around doing destruction and putting people in fear for their safety, yes, but I'd suggest that applies to self-appointed militias as well.
Yeah, which, by the way, I just want to interject here. Our audience is not going to be guilty of marauding. Our audience is more likely to be guilty of self-appointing enforcement for law and order. And so that's why we're speaking to this, right? Yeah.
Oh, for sure. But, and at the very, we may not go to a place even, most of us would not, go to a place like Rittenhouse did, but at least be sympathetic, to him going and doing that and kind of taking matters into your own hands.
Right.
Yeah. So we apparently have a lot of people in our culture and on our side of the political divide who are armed and ready for what they believe is the coming conflict. And the conflict, here's the thing, the conflict does not have to come to them. That there are many who are ready and willing to go to it. Rittenhouse drove 30 minutes to a different state where he, as far as I know, he knew no one. He wanted to be in the mix, even though he and his family and his city and even his state were not in any kind of immediate danger. But if you're self-appointed, then it doesn't matter where it is or who's involved, because who decides?
Right.
I do. I'm self-appointed. So you decide when you pull out your gun and go for a drive, even if you're only 17. The Bible teaches, for sure, self-defense. But as far as I've been able to find, it does not teach a kind of preemptive self-defense. Well, they may come here, so therefore I'll go get them there. We may as well have the fight now because we all know it's coming. So let's get it over with. And I'm admittedly saying this anecdotally, but I hear that kind of thing. We're heading toward a civil war. You need to wake up. Everybody needs to wake up. We're headed toward a civil war. I'm not saying that. That's what others are saying. And so we need to get with it. Now, you have the right and you have the biblical responsibility to defend those who are in your sphere of responsibility. But who is that? Your family, your neighbors. But that also means, as well, leave to other families and other neighbors to do the same in their area. Now, if there's a call to help, and so imagine, theoretically in a very dire circumstance, a sheriff might put a general call out that says, hey, we're overwhelmed. We need any able-bodied people who are willing to come out, and I'll sort of, in effect, deputize you all to come out here because it's completely broken down. Well, okay, you may then need to heed that call as well. Now, I've never heard of such an instance, in my lifetime, but theoretically that could happen. But just taking on yourself to decide I need to bring order to another city, carrying a deadly weapon, that's a breakdown of law and order too, just like the rioting is. And we live in a day when we have far too many people with this hair trigger because of what I said. They're convinced it's coming. They're watching chosen sources of media.
I was going to say convinced by whom.
Convinced by whom that this is coming. And even more than just the more mainstream types of that are designed to keep you watching. Then there's just, you can go down the rabbit hole as far as you want. And lots of people have. People found themselves on January 6th in Washington, D.C. who would have never thought that they would be there, but they had been convinced that our country is being taken from us. And so I've got to go and do something, and I'm going to go. And if it means breaking in, and if it means busting some heads, then so be it. So we've got lots of people with this hair trigger and a kind of bring it on attitude that are not, being vigilant for self-defense. They're not just looking out, they're looking for a reason. That is very dangerous. So having gone there, and with the circumstances on the ground as they were, and as the jury heard the evidence, I don't object to the verdict, but here's my own view. Rittenhouse had no business being there. If he was not there, two people, as far as we know, would be alive today.
Yeah, he is white, and the three people he shot, one of whom survived, are also all white, right?
Yeah.
So can we talk about what race had to do with this?
Right, yeah. Right, he's white, the victims are white, so what? Well, remember, the rioting in Kenosha was in protest of the killing of a black man by a white police officer. That was just a few months after the George Floyd had been murdered by a white police officer. Now, notice how I choose the language there. I say the one was killed in Kenosha. The other was murdered in Minneapolis because Rittenhouse was found not guilty of murder. So that's a killing. It's not a murder then. But Officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis was found guilty of murdering George Floyd, and so his death is not just a killing, rather it's a murder. So the black man killed in Kenosha is named Jacob Blake. He lived, but he is paralyzed after being shot 7 times in the back. 7 times in the back. The officer was not even charged. So it wasn't that the officer went to trial and was found not guilty. It didn't go to court. He wasn't tried. The reason is Blake had a knife, it turns out. Now, if people wield a weapon in the presence of an officer, then it's hard for me to argue that the officer cannot and should not use force, even deadly force. Now, I don't understand. I can't get my mind around 7 shots. I definitely can't get my mind around 7 in the back. But he did have a weapon when he was shot. So that's part of the racial component. The protests in Kenosha that Rittenhouse went to were over the shooting of a black man by a white police officer. But here's the other racial piece, though, in this. How many black guys could walk into a tense situation with an AR-15 hanging around their neck with no questions asked, really?
Yeah.
If you ask most people in the black community, and no, for those of you looking for a refutation of what I'm saying, which is fine, but at least refute it properly. No, I have not interviewed everyone in the black community. And if you ask me to define the black community, so I'm speaking generally, admittedly. I don't think I have to interview everyone in the black community. I'm not doing a research paper here. I haven't had anyone in our listening audience say this to me. I've had other people do this, though. And it's just a way to pick in a way that you can't make any point unless you've done a full research paper and have footnotes and the whole bit. So for those of you of that ilk, okay, there you have it, all right? But I believe, based on my own, yes, anecdotal experience, that our friends in the black community would overwhelmingly tell you, and for good reason, that a black man could not do that. If he not only came to the scene armed, but then used the weapon, what would happen to him? Now, we can all hope that he would get the same treatment that Kyle Rittenhouse did, but I understand why folks would be skeptical of that. I mean, look at what's happened to Rittenhouse then in the aftermath. He's a hero. Was invited to and visited former President Trump at Mar-a-Lago. He's a model patriot, according to many. He was offered an internship by a Republican congressman. Would a black man in the same circumstances get all or any of that? Our black friends would, I would wager, if I were a betting man, would overwhelmingly say no. I have a friend whose dad was involved in the riots in Detroit in the 60s because he was a firefighter. And he went there to help out put out the fires. And he saw a black man take up arms to defend a fire station against rioters. And he was considered a hero. And I've seen that used as evidence that, this thing with Rittenhouse is no different than that. Now, I don't doubt that story, but I do think you're going to need much more if the claim is that it's all the same for a black man and a white man when it comes to being armed and how both are treated when they are armed. Rittenhouse quickly became a kind of Rorschach test, where how you saw the events even before the verdict, which again, I think we should all respect the verdict. How you saw it betrayed where you are on the political spectrum. And I think it would be good for our listeners, those of us who are Christians, to really go out of our way consciously to avoid being susceptible to bias on matters that are not clearly biblical, like abortion, let's say. Now, I wrote about race on my blog, my Church Matters blog, last year, a couple of times, last summer, just after Jacob Blake was shot. And I used in the article, I used the word killed. He wasn't killed, he was shot. But I worded it carefully in a way to point out that there's been no trial or even charge at this point. And so I said this, it's a quote now, "At the outset, I want to make clear that I make no claim to knowing the particulars of what happened in this latest case other than what we've all seen on video. We'll need to await the results of the investigation to draw firm conclusions. So this whole Rittenhouse thing, I think, implicates a number of things that we Christians should care about. One is, all right, God gives the right to self-defense, but how and when should that be done? We should think about order as a gift of God's common grace and how that can break down not just by rioters, but by vigilantes or people who can easily become vigilantes because they just take matters in their own hands. And then possibly even inequality because of how one person is treated in a circumstance with a weapon walking into a tense situation and how others might be treated.
Yeah, important to think of all of those things in terms of a Christian worldview and what does God say about the issues at the heart of them. Good. So we had another decision come down in the last couple of weeks after the Rittenhouse verdict, and that was the guilty verdicts for 3 men of murdering 26-year-old Ahmad Arbury in Georgia. And I use the term murder there because of the verdict, like you said. So how might this case matter for Christians beyond the obvious fact that, okay, a man is dead, and unjustly so, according to the jury?
Well, the facts in that case are disturbing. You had 3 men stalk this guy, Arbury. Ultimately, one of them shot and murdered him. Now, we've not mentioned the race of those involved yet, but it matters for a reason that I'll give in a moment. Arbury, the victim, was black, and the 3 men found guilty of his murder are white. And Arbury was in their white neighborhood. And they testified that they thought he was there to steal because there had been burglaries in the weeks before, and they claimed that they thought he was the guy who had done these previous, and so they followed him, and they confronted him, and they told him to stop as he jogged and ran away, and ultimately there was a hand-to-hand fight in which one of the 3 white men who had brought a weapon shot and killed Arbury.
So they shot and murdered him, it appears, just because he was black.
Well, I'll assume that they shot and murdered him because they thought he was a thief. Now, the whole racial component to that is difficult to know, but giving them where they were and the history and all of that, but I don't know these guys, the McMichaels. That was a father and son, and then there was another man, a friend of theirs in the neighborhood. I don't know their background. I don't know if they've made racist comments in the past. I don't know. So I'll assume they thought he was a thief, black or white. But even so, they have no right to execute anyone.
Right.
And the vigilante justice is, in fact, yet another breakdown of order about which we should be concerned. But get this, and here's what's really disturbing about all this, and that is there would have been no trial of these 3 white men at all had not a video of this incident been leaked from the police department. One of the 3 men videoed this on his phone. And so the police took his phone into evidence, but they weren't going to do anything with it. And someone who saw it apparently thought it was important for the public to know and put it out there. But the prosecutors who had it, the local prosecutors who had it and saw it, declined to press charges, saying this was justified. This killing at that point was justified due to self-defense. So the only reason charges were brought was because the video surfaced. And because, since the video surfaced, now a prosecutor from outside of that city, Brunswick, Georgia, came in and pressed the case and got the guilty verdicts. I should add that local prosecutor, who was just going to sweep it under the rug, is now being prosecuted, which I think is a very good thing for the justice system. If you watch the videos, you see the police who finally come. You've got the victim laying on the ground, and in one that I saw and heard, it appears, now I want to emphasize it appears. If this turns out to be incorrect, then I've emphasized it appears. It appears that while the police are there and they're talking to the guys who chased him and the one who shot him, that Ahmad Arbury is laying on the ground and gasps audibly. He's still alive. but nobody's attending to him. And the police and the murderers are calmly talking to each other, honestly, like someone had hit a deer with their car in a deer lane. So, hey, what are we going to do here? The shooter asked the officer if he's going to handcuff him. Actually, it was a female officer, I believe. Is she going to handcuff? And she chuckles and says, "Of course not. Why would I cuff you?"
I'm trying very hard not to make the judgment because, like I said earlier, I'm not there. I'm not hearing all this in court. But that you can understand why somebody would assume this is racially motivated.
Sure.
The dispassionate manner there.
The inhumanity, right? And this is the way lynchings occurred. And in particular in this part of the country, with impunity. For a very long time, because local sheriffs and prosecutors and jurors, if it even went to a jury, would not pursue or would not find guilty. Just think about this. 1955, you have got in Money, Mississippi. That's the name of the town, Money. And you have got a teenager from Chicago who goes for part of the summer from Chicago down to Mississippi to visit some relatives. His name is Emmett Till. And his mother, Emmett's mother, told him, be careful down there. And so many of you may know the story, but he's accused of walking into just a small grocery store there and making a comment, an overture of some type. He's 14, I think, 14, 15, to a white woman who tells it to her husband. That night, the husband and another man go to where Emmett Till is, drag him out of bed.
His bed,
Take him and kill him, murder him, throw his body in the river. It's horrific. But in no time, the jury there finds them not guilty. They met, I think, for like 30 minutes. And, one person said they sat down for 30 minutes, and one person said, I don't even think they sat down. It's an all-white jury in Money, Mississippi. How are you going to get justice, for this? But pictures matter, like video. And so the mother, I think we talked about this at one time on one of our podcasts here, but the mother, Emmett Till's mother, his body was so disfigured that they said, look, we got to have a closed casket. She said, nothing doing. We're having an open casket. People are going to see what happened to my son. And pictures of his deformed and mutilated body went across the country. And just like for the civil rights movement as a whole in the 50s and 60s, when people saw the kind of brutality that was going on, it changed perceptions. But what we forget is we got to remember that that's only because we're now seeing it. What about all the decades where we weren't seeing it?
Right.
So since we didn't see it, it was easy to deny it ever happened or that it was as bad as was claimed. But now we can see it. And it still happens. Even in a day with ubiquitous cameras. Now think about that. If it happens when there's the real possibility of being seen, how often did it happen when very few ever saw? Now the great news is 11 white people in this Arbury case, one black juror confronted with video evidence. That's important. If we don't have the video evidence, we don't have even a trial. But hard to deny the video evidence, and they found all three guilty. We can be thankful again for the jury system, but let's not minimize the fact that injustice almost took place, and surely would have taken place, and certainly has for decades, absent the video.
So there's the second court decision, and as if those two things aren't enough news, we had also the Supreme Court hear arguments in an important abortion case 2 days ago, right? The issue of abortion obviously has interest to us as Christians who are people who love the giver of life and the lives that he gives, and so we want to protect it. But what's especially important about this case?
Well, as you suggest, that Christians should be definitional, that we are pro-life. And I understand now that the term pro-life refers to how one views abortion. and not necessarily all other aspects of life after birth. And so I'll continue to use the term that way. When I talk about being pro-life, it means being basically anti-abortion. But I do want to say this to our Christian friends, that I do think it's important that we seek to be, both in perception and in reality, people who care about life and all of it, before and after birth. And that's why we care about Ahmad Arbery's life as much as we care about Kyle Rittenhouse. And we refuse to betray a bias in favor of one over the other by tweeting our glee, for instance, at one verdict and then being silent or maybe even negative toward the other. In fact, I would recommend, friends, that if you're going to insist on being imbalanced, and I don't mean mentally imbalanced, but if you insist on being biased, if you insist on that, then be imbalanced in the direction that you need most to notice and to care about. Perhaps the one that's different from what your echo chamber is supporting. All right. So pro-life, abortion, Mississippi again. Mississippi, state of Mississippi passed a law that says that no one can get an abortion after 15 weeks, which is earlier than the 24-week standard that Roe v. Wade and then in 73 and Casey versus Planned Parenthood in 92 had set. That 24 weeks is the line of so-called viability, when the baby is viable outside the womb. So they passed that law.
That's just such an interesting, arbitrary line to me, because it's changing constantly with medical progress.
Well, not if you listen. Not if you listen to. You're right, but not if you listen to Sonia Sotomayor in the argument this week. She says nothing's changed. That's what she said. Nothing's changed.
Wow.
I know, exactly.
I hadn't heard that
She said
statement.
that.
That's incredible.
It is
And I
incredible.
mean that in the literal sense.
Yeah,
Incredible.
unbelievable.
Not worth credibility.
No credibility. That's right. Yeah. Well, the Supreme Court agreed to hear this case. And so that in itself made news, the fact that they were willing to hear it, because now the pro-abortion side is saying, okay, And they agreed to hear it a few months ago. They actually heard it. And when we say heard it, that means literally heard what are called oral arguments. And so the attorneys for each side are able to stand up before the 9 justices and make their case.
When you say the pro-abortion side said, I mean, they've seen this coming. I mean, they've been on the rampage for a while now, seeing kind of the writing on the wall.
They've been concerned, but now here it is,
right?
And here's a case, and the court majority, it doesn't take a majority, it only takes 4 out of the 9 to say we'll hear it, but 4 out of the 9, and I'm sure more than 4 were willing to hear it. And so the more liberal side on the court is concerned, and their allies. So this week they heard it by oral argument. Now the court can decide if they're going to allot a half an hour for oral argument or an hour. Usually they allot an hour for this, and for some cases, big cases, they allow a couple of hours, and in this case it was 2 hours for the oral argument. Now the background, quickly, is we've all heard of Roe versus Wade in 1973, and the Supreme Court, by a vote of 7-2, voted to say that a woman has a constitutional right to abortion. So if something is a constitutional right, then that is inviolable. I mean, you can't do anything, and for a very long time, there couldn't be anything that impinged in any way upon getting an abortion up to that 24-week viability, and even with exceptions, even after that. But then there was a case in 1992 called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and many people thought that might be what this Mississippi case now could be, an overturning of Roe v. Wade. Well, 5-4, they upheld Roe, but they modified it pretty significantly. They kept the viability line, but they said that states can create regulations for abortion up to viability. before viability, as long as they don't create what they called an undue burden on the woman. So that meant now you could have things like parental consent laws. So you couldn't do that before, but now you can have a parental consent law. Now you can have a 24-hour waiting period. Now you can say before a woman gets an abortion, she needs to see an ultrasound. So a number of states did these kinds of things, and it actually over time has had really positive effect. So that in Mississippi, there is one abortion clinic left. One.
Wow.
And that's true in lots of states where abortion clinics have shut down. So the pro-life movement has had great impact over the last few decades. Nevertheless, Roe still stands. The viability standard is still a constitutional right. That 5-4 decision in 92, of the 5 that upheld Roe but modified it, 3 of them were these Republican appointees. One was Sandra Day O'Connor, one was Anthony Kennedy, another one was David Souter. And they had all, within 10 years of that decision, had all been appointed by Republicans. And here they all voted to uphold. So on that case, you also, though, had that 5-4, 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Yep, you've got Sandra Day O'Connor, she's on the court. You got Anthony Kennedy, he's on the court. You got David Souter. But you also had, just the year before, Clarence Thomas had been put on. So Thomas voted to overturn it just a year into his time there. But it was upheld with that 5-4. Anthony Kennedy, writes the majority opinion. Now, what's interesting about that to me is Anthony Kennedy is on the court in 1992 because he was put on the court 5 years earlier in 87. And the reason that he is on the court at all is because Ronald Reagan had nominated a guy named Robert Bork. And Bork was borked.
When your name becomes a verb.
That's exactly what happened. His name became a verb. To this day, they talk about now judges being borked. Because prior to that, you didn't have it, but it was, you may remember how wild it was? Oh, man, it was a media circus, and all the liberal pro-abortion forces came against, all because of abortion, all because of that. Because Bork was very clear, Roe was wrongly decided, and it needs to be overturned. Well, he was not confirmed by the Senate, and Ronald Reagan now has to nominate someone else. And he nominates a guy named Douglas Ginsburg, not related to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a very conservative guy, Douglas Ginsburg. He's on the federal court bench and has been for decades now, a lifetime appointment. But he had been a law professor at Harvard, and he had smoked marijuana while he was at Harvard, and that news came out. So his nomination only lasted like 3 days. Now, Douglas Ginsburg, if you look him up, he turns out to be, I think, an excellent jurist. But he didn't make it to the Supreme Court.
He was just too early on the marijuana thing.
He said nobody would blink at it now, right? But then Kennedy is third string now. Now they have to have someone, and here's the key, non-controversial. So they get Kennedy. Kennedy is, yes, conservative, but he's not Bork. He's not Ginsburg. He's not really the kind of person Reagan wanted. But he gets put on. He writes the majority opinion in this Casey versus Planned Parenthood case in 92. And he says this. Here's his money quote. He says that the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence. You write your own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. I'm chuckling, but Kennedy had this penchant. He does that. He did the same kind of thing in Obergefell in 2015 that made gay marriage a constitutional. He wrote the majority opinion for that, and he did the same kind of stuff. And if you want to get a chuckle, read the late Antonin Scalia's dissent in that case, where he's quoting that. Oh, it's hilarious.
Just imagine.
Oh man, as he's going through and he's literally putting this in. He'll put a line of what Kennedy says, and he'll go, "Huh?" Say what? That kind of thing. But there it is, this vague kind of philosophical, right, kind of language, which is what the Supreme Court has allowed itself to become. they're, instead of leaving to the people, instead of leaving to the states and leaving to the democratic process, they have arrogated to themselves to determine this kind of thing. Or to just say, we determine that every individual gets to do this and the democratic process cannot. They've taken it out of that. But it left, that 92 case, left, as I said, viability in place. It kept abortion as a constitutional right, but it allowed these restrictions if they don't place an undue burden on the mother. So as I said, things like parental consent, you got to be close to or in a medical facility, you have to watch an ultrasound, you have to get counseling, all of that. And so you've had all of these abortion clinics close. Oral argument was this past week on Thursday. Sotomayor said nothing's changed, but she also sought to corner her colleagues by saying, I mean, I listened to most of that this week, and because it was live, you could listen to it. And she said the Mississippi law only exists, and she's probably right about this. Apparently, the legislators in Mississippi said, hey, now's the time for us to pass this law because we have new justices on the court. And so she pointed that out. And she said, so therefore, this is a political thing. And the reputation of this court will not survive, and this is her word, the stench of politics if we overturn Roe and Casey. So she's kind of cornered them in a way, right? By doing that publicly, because now if they overturn it, it's a political decision rather than a judicial decision, is the way she set that up. It's kind of a dirty pool, frankly, in my mind. Now, Donald Trump nominated 3 of the 6 possible votes to overturn this, with Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Barrett. So in 4 years, he got 3 appointments, which is amazing. So what's going to happen with it? You know,
I'm
what do you
still
predict?
thinking about that statement, her cornering statement. While essentially true, you could call it politics. It essentially is just a recognition that the complexion of the court has changed such that they may recognize the absurdity of what has been done in the past.
That's exactly what it is.
You could say it that way as well.
That would be a good way, wouldn't it? That would be a more accurate way. But she put this slant on it, this political slant. And I thought, wow, that's under him, because she says that now if the other side, and they never argue with each other in a personal way. They never do that. They argue the case, but they never. But she has now invoked a motivation, a political motivation, and put that taint on it. And I don't know that I would have had the restraint if I were on the court to be able to not say something, at least something like this. Well, we won't have to worry about that political taint, because if that claim is made by anyone, of course, we will all come to each other's defense. You would never allow a claim like that to stand.
Now we're each in our corner.
But no one said that. So what's going to happen with it? Having listened to that oral argument, it's really hard to tell exactly what's going to happen with that. They could overturn it outright, all of it, so that there is no longer a constitutional right, and state by state would have to decide.
It doesn't automatically make
nobody
abortion
can get
illegal
abortion,
everywhere.
right.
It just means
State by
now
state.
it falls to the states.
And the estimate is, though, like almost exactly half. I think 26 states would probably make it illegal, and 24 would make it legal. So it would be kind of half and half. Or they could leave it as a right, but remove that viability line. And states can continue to make laws like Mississippi, uphold Mississippi's now 15-week, standard. And states can continue to make laws that make it hard but not impossible. I think they have 5 votes to overturn it outright. But whatever, I can say this with confidence, it will be radically altered one way or another.
Wow. Well, that's 3 pretty heavy issues for just a couple of weeks. So we hope that our discussion, 2 pastors here talking about current events, is helpful in that it helps you think about what's going on in God's world from the perspective of what His Word tells us about life and truth. So we appreciate you watching as always. If you don't already, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you know when new episodes come out. We try to release new episodes every Saturday at 2 p.m. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.